When it comes down to it, almost every religion out there sets forth an idea of what it means to be a good person. But while we can usually agree on the benefits of virtue, who doesn't want to be kind and generous? It's the flip side, the idea of sin, that people have a lot of mixed feelings about.
It's just a very loaded word, isn't it? We mainly think of it as either quite a horrifying concept that's been used to beat people up with, to impose guilt from the outside, to make them feel unclean or unworthy. Or it sounds like lingerie and cupcakes and calories. Oh, it's a little bit sinful. So it was not, Seven Deadly Sins was not something I thought, that's a thing I'm desperate to talk about. And then they massively surprised me.
Elizabeth Oldfield is host of the Sacred Podcast and the author of Fully Alive, Tending to the Soul in Turbulent Times, a book that revisits and reinterprets Christianity's 7 deadly sins. Elizabeth wasn't always a devout Christian. She lost her faith while working as a religion writer for the BBC.
I was tasked with being the researcher on a particular episode of a big drama series that was going to be made of the Bible. I just had an utter and completely devastating loss of faith because the book was not what I thought it was, and therefore God wasn't what I thought God was. And I had clearly been a fool and ignorant and naive. And now was the time to sort of let go of all the childish fantasy and walk away.
Yet she found herself dissatisfied with the bleakness of modern secular life, a life often missing communal meaning and a deep moral vision.
Turns out I'm a terrible atheist. I just don't have the temperament for it. I really don't. I really tried hard not to believe in God. And it was this very strange sensation of like my spirit was continuing a conversation with the divine whilst my mind was trying to shut it down. And eventually I gave up because it was making me feel mad.
And because of that nagging yearning, she decided to look deeper into Christianity's past, and in so doing, found a way back to faith. A way that includes thinking about the 7 deadly sins, not as an instrument of oppression or repression, but rather like a helpful manual for understanding and addressing human weakness and foibles.
I quote Francis Spufford, whose shorthand for sin is the human propensity to F things up.
On this episode, the first of season 7, we're going to rethink the meaning of sin and maybe, just maybe, figure out what we can all do to F things up a little bit less. I'm Dave DeSteno, and this is How God Works.
You know, Jesus is very enigmatic. The Bible is extremely complex and needs to be treated with care. But he says, judge not lest you be judged. Focus on your own soul. Forget about what's going on with everyone else. And when someone asked Jesus to sum up the whole law, he said, love God and love your neighbor, right? He put relationships at the heart of everything.
This, for Elizabeth, is the key to understanding sin. It's not really about judging others. It's about that second part, relationships. Yes, if you're a person of faith, you want to have a good relationship with God. But sinful acts don't only mess up that relationship. They mess up all relationships. Those with friends, family, coworkers. And when it comes to social relationships, both science and religion agree that we humans are built to be interdependent.
Treating each other with care, taking seriously our vulnerability, that's what makes us fully human.
We only flourish when we're connected to others. So anything that disconnects us is a problem.
We disconnect from our own soul, from other people, and yes, from divine love. That's what sin is. And I see that playing out all over the place. And being realistic about it and talking about it honestly suddenly felt actually quite humanizing and reassuring. The more I wrote myself into this, the more it felt like a really helpful framework for self-understanding. And I am very in favor of all the other frames we have to understand ourselves, right? I think about my attachment model. Therapy is tremendously helpful. Understanding trauma, right? Understanding personality types and temperament. I don't want to discount any of that. But left to my own devices, I will too often choose disconnection over connection. And the practices of my tradition help with that. They continually point me back towards connection, and they continually point me back towards relationship. And therefore, they're helping me become the kind of person I actually want to be. And I think most of us want to be loving, right? And honest and free and brave. And then we're looking at the choices we actually make, which are, and I very much include myself in this, somewhat short of those values and principles. Having a name for that is helpful. It just seems pretty effective, actually, not to be too utilitarian about it.
This practical way of thinking about sin, impulses and behaviors that get in the way of living a good life, isn't some new invention. It goes right back to the early monks nearly 2,000 years ago, who first came up with what we now call the 7 deadly sins.
And there's extraordinary wisdom and reflection that come out of the Desert Fathers and the Desert Mothers. They started as a list of 8 bad thoughts. Evagrius of Pontus started noticing what were the temptations that the monks were continually having to battle with. What was keeping them from prayer? What was keeping them from a sense of freedom? What was keeping them from a sense of joy?
The list changed over the centuries, and these days it's fallen out of the mainstream in many Christian denominations. More listicle and meme fodder than a spiritual guide that people take seriously. But Elizabeth argues that it's as relevant as ever, because the sins it outlines point to some of the most common ways we as humans tend to do damage to ourselves and those around us. Reconceptualizing what they mean in the context of modern life can help us all work through some of today's most pressing challenges, whatever our beliefs. So that's what we're going to do today. We'll look at each of the 7 deadly sins through the lens of society right now. With that in mind, I wanted to start our conversation with one of the items on the list that feels most urgent and dangerous to me in the United States right now: wrath.
So my conception of wrath is as the subset of anger that disconnects us. And that's true of all the sins. Drawing on the life of Jesus, we see him getting angry. He gets righteously angry. It is not necessarily something to be avoided. Anger can be a very helpful and indeed necessary emotion towards connection, towards relationship, towards justice. But when it becomes contempt, Arthur Brooks defines contempt as anger mixed with disgust. That's when it becomes poison. And we know from the Gottman Institute work on romantic relationships that contempt is poison in romantic relationships. I think it's sort of self-evidently true that it's also poison in societies, in cultures, when we both have contempt towards other people and we are then continually encouraged and reinforced to have contempt for them. Our natural tendency towards tribalism and polarization gets accelerated, and that's what we're seeing right now.
Elizabeth is talking about a human trait called homophily. Basically, it's an inbuilt preference for people we perceive to be like us, whether it's how they look and sound, or the fact that they value the same things, hold the same opinions. You get the point. In and of itself, there's nothing wrong with it. In fact, it was a key factor in helping our ancestors cooperate successfully and survive in small groups. But now that our world has gone global, and we need to figure out how to get along with all sorts of people, homophily can sometimes work against us. After all, the flip side of preferring people like me is that it makes it really easy, even sometimes satisfying, to feel contempt for people not like me. It's a surprisingly small step from, I don't understand you, to, you must be inferior, or even evil. And the less time we spend with people not like us, the harder it is for us to learn to bridge that gap. It's an age-old problem, of course, but in recent years, many of the community spaces that used to help bring people from different backgrounds together have eroded. And at the same time, the rise of targeted on-demand content and personalized feeds has played an outsized role in pushing us further into bubbles of similarity. The result? It's what we're seeing in the United States right now. A frightening rise in contemptuous anger for those people in the other bubbles whose decisions we can't understand. In cases like these, wrath can feel pretty impossible to overcome. Is there anything we can even do to push back against it?
I think this is maybe the crown jewels of the Christian tradition, and yet the Christians are so often the worst at embodying it. We have This story in the Gospels, where we see Jesus be in his bones an anti-polarization person, he is just walking around, breaking taboos, being seen with whoever he shouldn't be seen with, no concern for his reputation. I mean, it's like puckish, it's playful. He walks into a scene and then he winks at the camera and he's like, who is going to make everyone lose their mind if I go sit with them? The rapacious capitalist or the sex worker, again and again and again and again, to the point it gets funny. If you read the Gospels through this lens, Jesus is someone who gives no Fs whatsoever for other people's understanding of tribal boundaries and moral purity. And then he gives us some very, very practical things. The really famous phrase where Jesus says, if someone strikes you on the face, turn the other cheek, steady yourself. Do not hit them back. Do not pour contempt on them. Do not attack them. Do not insult them. And don't run away. Don't withdraw into your little filter bubble. Don't go passive, but stay. Stay connected. Stay in relationship. Look them in the eye. Flip the dynamics of the situation. And that, which has been so embodied in the nonviolent tradition, as like meet threat, meet attack with as much compassion and empathy and steadiness as you can. And then he goes even further and says, don't just love your neighbors, love your enemies. And pray for them. It's doing something very similar as loving kindness meditation would be in expanding our circles of compassion. We start with love God, love your neighbor as yourself, love your enemies, and pray for those who persecute you. And when they do harm to you, do good back to them. Bless them.
This can all seem a little sanctimonious, like, be the bigger person because it's the right thing to do. But does it actually solve anything?
So one way that this worked out in my life is I was once tweeting something I thought very innocuous and had someone that I knew a little bit, actually, a high-profile atheist in the UK, and I was running a Christian think tank at the time, really go on the attack. You know, a long thread, calling me names, disingenuous, I didn't understand my own faith, I hadn't read any evolutionary psychology, basically called me stupid and dishonest. And I felt this rush, right? Cortisol and adrenaline, this like, you effing, the rage, the wrath, the sense of actually, I want to hurt you. I want to make you feel small. I want to attack back. Drafted this whole tweet that was like, I think you'll find that Boltman that you're referencing was overturned in the scholarly consensus in 1960. Don't you dare mansplain my religion to me, you effing, real, like, how do I make you feel like I felt? But because I've been learning about turning the other cheek and fight or flight and how we respond in those situations, I had just enough consciousness to go, wait, just wait a minute. And I made my husband lock me out of my Twitter account.
Elizabeth spent the next 4 days riding her bicycle around London, arguing with this man in her head. And even though at first she was burning pretty hot, after a while, she started to run out of steam. She was still mad, but her stress response had cooled down.
And eventually I remembered that the thing I was supposed to be doing was praying for him. And as soon as I prayed for him, just went. The contempt and the rage just went. And I was able to go back on and I said, ow, you seem really angry. Would you like to come for dinner to talk about it? And he did. And we had several lovely dinners and we're still occasionally in touch and I understand him better. And he got to the end of the dinner and said, I really didn't understand where you're coming from, but now I understand it much more. I didn't hit back and I didn't run away. And that for me is the very budget, low stakes type of turning the other cheek that I think is possible for us all to do and can be surprisingly transformative.
This isn't just Elizabeth's experience. Prayer and meditation have been shown to help us overcome wrath, an emotion that often leads to aggression. As one example, the psychologist Brad Bushman and colleagues created a setup where people were insulted by someone and then given the opportunity to cause him pain by subjecting him to incredibly loud noise blasts. The noise blasts didn't happen, of course, but participants thought they would. But here's the catch. Half of the participants were asked to pray for the person after he insulted them. The other half were simply told to think about him. When it came time to choose whether to blast him, those who were told just to think about him let him have it. They wanted to make him suffer. But those who were told to pray for him didn't. Prayer wiped out any hint of aggression. In my lab, we found something similar with meditation. In one experiment, we found that people who meditated regularly for 3 weeks refused to punish a person who insulted them, something those who hadn't been meditating were all too happy to do. It's examples like these that show the power of spiritual practices to help reorient us away from sins like wrath, and as Elizabeth would say, toward connection. After the break, we'll explore Elizabeth's take on the remaining 6 deadly sins, and we'll also ask, where does forgiveness come into the picture? So I wanted to talk about the next 2 sins together, because it seems to me they have some key things in common. They're gluttony and acedia, which most people might know better as sloth. These sins can seem really judgmental, even cruel in the way they're stereotypically understood. You know, like shaming people for enjoying their food, or having a lazy afternoon on the couch. But in Elizabeth's understanding, that's not what they are at all. They're actually about how certain tendencies, when taken too far, can lead us to disconnect from others and even the world around us.
So acedia is one of those words a bit like shalom that is not directly translatable into one word, which is why it's so helpful. In there is spiritual apathy, listlessness, ennui. But the thing I really landed on was distraction, failing to attend to the important things. And I don't need to tell your listeners that this is endemic. It's endemic in my life. It's endemic in our society. It's another way in which our culture is forming us away from the kind of people that we long to be.
You know what this looks like. How many times have you said no to a dinner with friends you really enjoy because you felt tired or busy, and then stayed up way too late binging a TV series instead? Or been out at a restaurant, sitting in silence while your date scrolled through their social media feed or texted other people?
I think humans have always been distracted, right? There's a reason that it's on the list. Monks clearly found it difficult to focus too. Otherwise, acedia would not have been one of the 8 bad thoughts, and they did not have an iPhone. We have the natural human tendency plus. You know, again, this kind of weaponization of our temptations against us is happening. And gluttony, the branding around it is kind of laughable and associated with fat shaming and all these things that I have no desire to be aligned with. But it's getting at something, I think, about numbing, about behaviors that we are not fully in control of and that we do because actually we don't want to feel our feelings. We don't want to stay in connection with our own soul and what it longs for. And so for me, gluttony is addiction. It is the large ones that send you to rock bottom and into recovery, and the small ones that we all are tangled up in difficult ways.
It's the difference between going out for ice cream with your family or friends as a treat versus mindlessly making your way through a pint of Ben & Jerry's in a daze after a bad day at work. Or putting food aside, numbing yourself with alcohol or cannabis. When we start thinking of gluttony and acedia in this way, they start to feel a lot more familiar to most of us. But it does seem to be happening more and more in recent decades. Why is that?
Even though in actuality, we've never had it better, I'm talking specifically about in the UK and Western Europe and America, most people have access to healthcare. We are not currently in a war, right? We can expect our children not to die young. In terms of our material well-being, we have never had it better. And yet there is high levels of existential despair around. And some of that is, I think, a reasonably justified response to what's going on with climate change. And some of it is this fracturing of our political life. And so, of course, when we're struggling for meaning, we no longer have stable centers of belonging. We're told to form our own identity rather than having it co-created in community as it's been over centuries and still is in healthy societies in the world. Of course, we're going to take the edge off, right? Of course, we're going to distract ourselves with overwork or social media or slightly too much wine.
If part of what's causing this existential despair is the loss of community institutions that used to help us build structure and meaning into our lives, then the most obvious thing to do is look back to the tools those institutions offered. Here, Elizabeth suggests 2 practices that can help. The first is structuring time. Almost all religions set out schedules for our days, weeks, and years. Times to pray, times to contemplate, times to celebrate or be in community. If you're already part of a group, embracing that structure can help with focusing your attention and reconnecting with other people. If you're not, it may be a question of discovering how to build meaningful structure into your days in a way that makes sense to you. Friend of the show, Casper ter Kuile, talks a lot about how to do this in his writing on rituals. The other thing religions are good at is creating opportunities for us to feel awe or have ecstatic experiences, which is one of the best ways to counteract that tendency to numb ourselves in the face of difficult emotions. Whether you're religious or not, it doesn't mean you have to look for extreme rituals or start downing magic mushrooms just to feel something. As psychologist Dacher Keltner has suggested, even simple activities like walking in nature or singing in a group can move us to feel awe. There's one more sin that involves excess in a way that's similar to acedia and gluttony: avarice. You may have heard it called greed, but according to Elizabeth, avarice is more specific because it zeroes in on money and material possessions. And while most of us would rather not think about it, Elizabeth says that pretty much everyone who isn't struggling to pay their bills probably has some work to do in this area.
Part of what drove this book was climate anxiety. A real sense of, we are living at a time of endings. Who do we need to be becoming? I can't necessarily stop these enormous forces, but I can pay attention to what is the kind of person that the world needs if it is the end of the world, in quotes, at least the end of the world as we have known it, the world we were told to expect. And a lot of what's driven these crises, where we've ended up, is that we have seemingly bottomless appetite for comfort, convenience, and consumer crap, and have allowed not the smallest compromise in that, even when people in other parts of the world are already dying out of the consequences of our choices, right? The starkness of the warnings against the love of money and the accumulation of wealth in my scriptures are really very difficult to read. I have to read them with one eye closed because I am so aware of my own hypocrisy and how enmeshed I am in unjust economic systems. But this, it feels like the oldest lie, that we will be able to feel safe if we have enough stuff, and we will be able to protect ourselves from human vulnerability through money. And it's also the oldest soul danger. It feels like the knottiest, deepest, most pervasive temptation to disconnection. Because we've been told that this is how you become a grown-up. This is how you are a responsible person. You earn enough money and you have a nice pension, you have a savings account, and you provide for your kids, and you maybe give away like 5% if you're a very generous person. Meanwhile, there are people on your street with no shoes and no money. And you could spare it, right? I could spare more money than I spare for the people who are living right on the edge of survival, and I don't. What my tradition gives me is at least a harder time ignoring that fact. I show up at church and I give. I don't give enough, but I give, and I give collectively, and that helps. I show up at church and I am reminded to be grateful for what I have, which is a little bit of an antidote to the hedonic adaptation that's always ignoring the things we already have and craving the things that we don't yet have. But this needs really, really strong medicine, this one.
Elizabeth makes a great point about gratitude. Every religion has prayers that nudge us to count our blessings. And research from many labs, including my own, shows that gratitude is the perfect cure for avarice. When you feel grateful, you become more honest, more generous, and more willing to accept sacrifices to ensure a better future. So cultivating gratitude regularly offers a bit of daily protection against slipping into a mindset of avarice. When it comes to desiring things, avarice has a cousin of sorts. Whether or not we think of it as a sin, envy is one of the emotions people feel the most shame about. And that may be in part because it can make us feel so helpless. If you want to be less greedy, you can take concrete steps to help, like giving more away. But what about envy? how do you stop comparing yourself to others?
Envy is more about our own unstable sense of self. And so my shorthand for it is status anxiety. I think the role of status is enormous in human societies, in human interactions. Our desire to stabilize our sense of self as someone worthy and valuable in comparison to other people plays out in every gathering where you ever see human beings in a room. That scanning, that subtle signaling, that puffing up, that low-level humiliation that happens, particularly when we're just meeting people. But in general, that jostling to be the alpha, that jostling to be the most impressive or the most intelligent or the funniest or the hottest or the wokest or the most conservative or whatever it is in our particular tribe. I don't know that there is any permanent way out of it. But certainly the claim of my tradition and the claim of lots of religions is that we are able to secede from that game, that we can find a different place to ground our identity, that we can see our sense of self as a gift and understand all human beings as equal, no matter their external signifiers. And I feel like I'm only just beginning to get that story inside me, but I know that it feels like a healthier and freer place to live than the toxic status anxiety jostling that I'm easily drawn into otherwise.
Even though status anxiety is about comparing ourselves with other people, it is ultimately a way of being too centered on ourselves. And while there is no perfect solution to this very human tendency, one of the best ways to loosen envy's hold is to remember that it's not all about you, that each of us is just one part of a much larger whole. Religions often remind us of this through stories, but again, even taking the time to contemplate the vastness of the universe, or take an awe-inspiring walk in nature can do the trick, as research shows that awe often makes us feel small, yet part of something bigger. Try it next time you feel the green-eyed monster tugging at you. Next up is pride. And to me, this one is a little trickier. Can't pride be a good thing? You know, like having pride in your work or your skills?
So I really struggled with this because, yes, how we have used this word has really changed. It's now used in all these really positive ways, right? People go on a pride march as a response to the inheritance of oppression and humiliation. And it's a way of stabilizing a sense of self and actually taking back some sense of belovedness. Where I got to on pride is it is about buying that lie that we are self-contained, that we don't need other people and we don't want other people to need us. Pride is essentially individualism. It's the reaction to how difficult it is to live a relational life, how annoying other people are, taking care of their needs, attending to their preferences.
Science backs Elizabeth up here. The key to whether pride is virtue or vice depends on that social part. Work from my lab shown that pride is seen as a good thing when it reflects a skill or resource you're willing to share with people, a recognition that we all have something valuable to offer to help our fellows. Where it goes off the rails is when we see ourselves as truly special, as above others, or start assuming we're great at everything.
The opposite is love, really. Iris Murdoch's very famous quote about love is the very difficult realization that someone other than oneself is real, feels like it encompasses the move from me, from pride to love, from pride to community. It's the definition of sin that Luther and Augustine uses, homo inconvertus en se, which means man or humanity turned in on itself. And that's pride for me, the bit of us that withdraws, the bit of us that disconnects, the bit of us that pulls in. And you can hear a shadow of it when someone says they were too proud to ask for help.
I haven't heard pride talked about in that way before, but it makes sense. It also, in some sense, makes me think of lust. Because people might say, what's wrong with lust? It's the way we procreate. It's a natural feeling. But I think you make the point that it also, a key element in there is how we think of that other person in that erotic relationship.
I don't think lust is how we procreate. I think desire is the driver in us to have sex in order to procreate. And I don't think my tradition has any problem with it. Doesn't have any problem with pleasure, right? This is a gift. The place I landed in how I define lust is disconnecting sexual activity. And particularly, I think what the heart of the Christian sexual ethic is warning against is sex that treats another person like an object. And there's a lot of that about. and sex that does not take human vulnerability seriously, and that extractive, objectifying activity without due care to the beauty and the vulnerability of your partner or partners is how I define lust. And I think I have become more and more convinced that the Christian sexual ethics warning against it are not moralizing buzzkill, but bracing medicine.
There are plenty of ways to F things up, as Elizabeth likes to say. But these are 7 of the big ones. And odds are, as we made our way through this list, some of them hit home more than others. Maybe they even made you feel a little uncomfortable. They did for me. One of the reasons many of us might want to avoid thinking about the ways we fall short is that they don't just influence how other people see us. They can also affect how we see ourselves. But according to Elizabeth, that's where the concept of sin, when done right, has something to offer. It helps move us away from, I am a bad person, and toward, I did a bad thing. And that makes it a bit easier for us to look our mistakes in the face, which is essential if we want to move past them.
There's something about getting honest about these things in our life. The worst tendencies of the therapeutic culture, and I'm very much a fan of good therapy, but the worst tendencies are that we explain things away, right? We say, but we're just a product of our systems. We're just a product of advertising. Of course, we're not generous enough, but nor's anyone else. And we look around and we check that no one else is sort of radically better than us. And we go, this is okay. This is the social norm. What healthy religion does, frankly, is it makes that harder. And it says, are you going to be honest? Are you going to be honest about who you actually really want to be and how far you're failing from that, and then try and get some help with that? Or are you going to shove that really uncomfortable, disquieting thought back down again and leave it where it is?
When you confront your own failings, part of it might make you feel like, well, I don't want to think about that, because it's uncomfortable to recognize our own failings. And so there has to be this sense of, yes, I've done something wrong, but also a route to overcoming that. So when you think about sin, how do you think about forgiveness? Because without that other part, we're not going to really work through it.
No, we're just going to end up in despair. Without holding together sin and forgiveness, sin and reconciliation, sin and restoration, rupture and repair, which is the dynamic I see again and again in my tradition, I'm not sure sin would be a particularly healthy concept. When I was realizing I wanted to write a book about sin, it was partly a sense that the alternative moral climate that we've ended up in is not better. That when we have a sinless society in which no one is ever responsible for anything, because we're all just a product of our trauma, the unjust systems in which we are all just dancing on a string, the selfish genes in us dancing to the music of the spheres, whatever. If no one's responsible, no one is forgivable. And so you have this weird mesh of both explaining away the poor choices that we all make, but then not allowing us to ever change and move forward. And something about sin and forgiveness, rupture and repair, fracture and reconciliation, the ethic that I see at the heart of the Christian tradition feels more likely to allow us to change and grow than this sort of strange ambient moral atmosphere that we have otherwise.
Life's a journey, but when it comes to the idea of sin, there's a tendency to be focused on the end of that journey if you're a person of faith. What will God think? How will God judge me? But here's the thing Elizabeth's view makes clear. Avoiding sin isn't just about pleasing God for God's sake. It's advice for how to live a good life, how to find joy and connection while you're here, how to make a positive impact in this world. As we said at the top of the episode, avoiding the 7 deadly sins is something like a user manual for humans. And with science backing up the benefits of honesty, generosity, kindness, and the like, the virtues that come from avoiding these sins, this user manual is one we all can adopt, whatever our beliefs. Doing that means facing our faults, learning from them, and yes, forgiving ourselves for our failures. That self-compassion doesn't mean we're letting ourselves off the hook. It doesn't mean loosening our standards. It's just a recognition that none of us is perfect. And self-forgiveness, rather than self-flagellation, is what helps us persevere and do better the next time, something every bit of research on self-compassion out there backs up. Next time on How God Works, we all know about YOLO. You know, you only live once. The kind of no regrets mentality that on its surface seems like a great philosophy to live by. A bold, free, and happy one. But while it might sound great, it turns out it's not. Confronting regret is actually a really important and necessary part of helping us flourish.
The idea that you should never have negative emotions and you should never look backward is foolish, because regret is an emotion that, when we treat it right, is powerful, misunderstood, but powerful in helping us make progress in the future.
And while regret certainly doesn't feel good, and can even make us feel trapped sometimes, it's what we do with it, how we think about it, that can lead us towards greater knowledge and happiness. And it's here that spiritual wisdom can help.
That's what mindfulness actually is the ability to be with whatever our experience is. And then on top of that, essential to the practice of meditation is the ability to begin again.
How God Works is hosted by me, Dave DeSteno. This episode was written by Sophie Eisenberg and me. Our senior producer is Josie Holtzman. Our producer is Sophie Eisenberg. Our associate producer is Emmanuel Desarme. Executive producer is Genevieve Sponsler. Merritt Jacob is our mix engineer and composed our theme, which was arranged by Chloe DeSteno. The executive producer of PRX Productions is Jocelyn Gonzalez. This podcast was also made possible with support from the John Templeton Foundation. To learn more about the show and access episode transcripts, you can find our website at howgodworks, all one word, .org. And for news and peeks at what's coming, feel free to follow us on Instagram at HowGodWorksPod, or me on X or Blue Sky at David DeSteno.